All right, so welcome. This is lecture 21 of 1413. We're going to talk about poverty as seen through the lens of psychology. What are we going to do? I'm going to give you some broad overview. We're going to particularly talk about this work on Scarcity by Mani et al., which is the idea that thinking or thoughts about poverty captures people's minds, which in turn leaves less capacity in people's minds to do other things. And then we're going to talk a little bit at the end, at least briefly, about other deprivations that poverty entails. Some of this is work that I've done, some of this is work by others. Okay, so I want to start with like a simple observation that is sort of like at the heart of a lot of this literature. And the observation is that when you look around in the world and look for evidence, and when you work on poverty-related issues, you'll see or observe quite a few seemingly suboptimal behaviors among the poor. This would be things like lack of investment or taking advantage of high return investment opportunities. This would be like investment in fertilizer or health investments or machines or the like. Or like low savings, in particular, sort of things like precautionary savings, like being ready for shocks, saving for the future, for the retirement, and so on. At the same time, sort of high return or high interest rate credit. People take very high interest loans. In part, what I've shown you earlier in the class, that's particularly prevalent among the poor. There's some evidence of like worse performance of parenting among poor parents, including like things like violence against children and so on. There's some evidence of lower productivity, punctuality, lower medical adherence for like, drugs that are sort of even very high stakes drugs that are life saving. There's some evidence of food and drug consumptions in terms of like healthy eating or excessive drug use and the like. All of those things tend to be correlated one way or the other with different forms of income or poverty. Okay, and so now you might sort of say, well, that's interesting, but now what explains these behaviors? How do we think about this? What are plausible explanations, kinds of correlations? To be very clear, these are correlations, not causal effects. So education could explain quite a few of those things. Could explain potentially productivity. It could explain potentially parenting. And it could explain some form of like financial investments. It could also explain things like medical adherence. Like, for example, if you look at in some settings where people have not sort of learned in school any basics of medicine or biology and so on, and sort of then it's not obvious that you should take medicine from a traditional doctor versus from some healer in the village, because how would you know what's better and what's worse? And sort of presumably some of these things you would learn in school. So one broad explanatory factor is sort of like omitted variables, if you went, and one of them is potentially education. It's not about like omitted variable. This is about like a treatment effect of poverty itself, and I'm going to be more specific about that. But essentially, it's something about like being in poverty itself affects people's behaviors that causes then some of these outcomes, some of these things that we've seen here. We're going to talk about that in detail, but that's exactly right. I mean, in some ways, like people would say, even for like if you take credit, for example, or for some things, you probably can't explain. But for high return investment, you would say, wow, there's uncertainty and there's a good chance that there might be losses at the end of the day. And if you're really close to subsistence, you might not want to invest in stuff because, if a bad shock happens, that's really bad. So I think some of that is right. And punctuality, for example, could also be in some way uncertainty. As like you try to take a bus to work and the bus just comes every hour, and then sometimes it comes half an hour earlier and sometimes comes later, and it's really hard to be actually punctual. It could just be like some people are not productive and they're just bad at doing stuff, and therefore they become poor, and then they end up being poor because of that. So that's essentially, I think, that we covered pretty much everything. So one is It could be sort of environmental conditions, which is, transportation. It's really hard to get to work on time, or like you have to commute for 2 hours and then you're really tired and that makes you less productive. Things like predatory lending sort of tricks you into like lending. There could be some things about institutional structures, which is to say, like, I told you, for example, at MIT, there's a default, or in other places, there's defaults for people to save money, and there's a default to like get health insurance, and there's defaults for all sorts of like good behaviors, like, for vaccinations and so on and so forth, where you're sort of like essentially pushed by society or by the environmental conditions that you face into doing the right thing, or whatever, good behaviors, whatever you want to call them. And so, so the poor might just not have those things. So, for example, having a bank account might be like if you paid daily, or even by like Trip, the rickshaw drivers that I was showing you earlier in the semester, they pay trip by trip, and then they pass by like the liquor stores essentially daily and have a bunch of cash on hand. Well, that's much trickier to sort of resist in some sense if you were particularly also prone to physical pain, and then sort of to use alcohol as a way to like deal with your physical pain, as opposed to somebody who is paid monthly and half of the money goes into like the rent anyway and like on other expenses and so on, which is much easier to manage. So that's kind of like broadly, I would summarize it as like environmental conditions. Then there's like selection and omitted variables, which is some, I think Joseph was mentioning education, which is a very good one. There's things like intelligence, talent, effort, mistakes, and so on. But you might say, well, like if you are more prone, if you're less productive, for example, if you're prone to making mistakes and so on, well, that sort of leads to worse outcome, and that makes you end up being poor. And that's really like sort of like in some sense, like a right-wing kind of view that said, like, they should do whatever they want to do, and like if they end up being poor, it's sort of their fault, and so on. That's, of course, not what we're going to argue here. What we're interested in, or what I'm trying to argue, show you some evidence of, is that there's a treatment effect of poverty itself potentially, which is to say that like being poor itself causes these behaviors. And I'm going to show you evidence of like in two ways. One is by inducing thoughts about money, essentially thinking about, can you pay school fees, can you pay your rent, can you get groceries for your children, are your children going to be hungry tonight, and so on. These are all kind of thoughts that invade people's minds involuntarily, and by doing so, they capture people's attention, and then since attention overall is limited, people have less attention available for other things. That's sort of one broad theory, and I'll focus on that mostly, which sort of calls people refer to under the name of scarcity. And then, there's a bunch of other aspects of poverty as well that might be impeding with people's cognitive function, their attention, that tire them out. They're just like not sleeping well, being in pain, being exposed to pollution, environmental pollution, noise pollution, and so on and so forth. And so now, what's the underlying sort of idea here? Well, the underlying idea is that there might be what's called people might want to call a behavioral poverty trap. And the broad line of argument is that poverty affects people's cognition, decision-making, and productivity. These factors, in turn, then influence people's future poverty, because if you're not productive and you can't save money and so on, you're going to be more poor in the future. And then if those things are going on, there's essentially some form of a vicious cycle going on, which makes it difficult, if not impossible, for a person to become rich. Now, notice at the very least that will lower mobility. Sometimes if you're poor and you want to become richer, you have to deal with a bunch of bad stuff that happens to you every day. But it might just be your mobility is low. It might be like actually a trap. It's just next to or actually impossible to become richer because all these forces are too strong to overcome for people. So today we're going to talk about two broad lines of research. I'm going to focus mostly on the first one, which is monetary concerns capture people's cognitive function. I'm going to talk a little bit then about other poverty-induced deprivation and behaviors, which might have sort of similar effects overall. Okay, so now I want to do like a simple test with you. So what I'd like you to do is to, so one second, actually, I need to, give me a second. I'd like you to, one second. Okay, Ready? Don't write anything down. Just try to remember it and then try to recall it in a bit. Okay, I'm going to start reading. Bed, rest, dream, doze, snore, slumber, blanket, snooze, wake, nap, awake, tired. Okay, now please write down as many words as you remember. You have 10 more seconds. Right, so done. So usually I would sort of like have people raise their hands, which is a little tricky, but so I'm gonna just read you the list of words and you can nod to me. I can see some of you at least, you can nod and tell me whether you remember um, the, the words that I read. Okay, I'm gonna start. Bed, rest, pretty good. Dream, doze, snore, no. Slumber, sleep, blanket, snooze, wake, nap, awake, tired. Okay, so I know this is making everybody sleepy and want to take a nap. Me too. So here's a list of words that I asked you to remember. Now, one thing that's kind of nice, you know, like most people remember quite a few things. The majority, for example, remembers bed and so on and so forth. Now, what's quite interesting about these words is that while I remember, I put all these names up here, which is, you know, these are the words that I actually read. Now, one word that's actually missing in this list here is sleep. And so you sort of, I snuck this in here on, this is why I had to go back. It turns out I actually didn't read the word sleep. Now, quite a few of you were nodding happily when I asked you about sleep. And what's the reason why sleep is, why you remembered sleep? So all of these words is like, they all around sleep. So like, it's really like, sleep should have been there. It's kind of the type of thing where people would ask you, like, have you been to the party last week? Where like people just assume, where essentially all of the friends were there, people just assume that you were there as well because you're supposed to be there. It's like sleep is supposed to be in this list, but he didn't put it there. And sort of this is what called like false memory tests, and there's quite a bit of work on actually false memories, and people's minds essentially make up things. In particular, stuff that sort of, or where you have associations that you think that should be the case. You can do the same with like man and other lists and so on. And now psychologists have been doing like studies for the rich and the poor. And so here's two lists. One is about sort of money related stuff, and one is about sort of just anything that's related to like, I guess, man or like gender in some ways. And I looked at how many people have certain false memories. And what these studies show is essentially that when you take this list for man, when you do this with high and poor, high income and low income people, the fraction who remember man wrongly is about like 15 to 20%. The fraction among the poor who remember money is similarly high. Among the rich, that's not the case. Now, why is that? Well, it seems to be that like for the poor, when you read lists like groceries, expense, bill, gas, etc., what they think about is essentially how I'm going to pay for this, and they think about money. When for the rich, and instead, when you say like groceries or whatever, they think about like what I'm going to buy for dinner and what are the nice things I'm going to do. And for them, this is really not top of mind. So this is essentially at least one piece of evidence that money captures the minds of the poor more so than for the rich. Now, a second study is a study about the doctor's visit. So this is a study where they participants were asked about the following situation, which is, imagine that you have been feeling sick lately and finally decide to go see a doctor about it. The doctor explains you have a serious condition that requires immediate attention. The good news, however, is you are virtually guaranteed to make a full recovery. The doctor writes several prescriptions. You will also need to make several appointments. What would be on your mind or how would you feel about when you hear this news? What are the three things that you think about it or feel? You can think about for a second, what is it that you would feel, and what are you thinking about when you see this? And what's particularly interesting is now when you look at people's responses, some people say wife, son, coworker. Some people are scared, afraid, worried, relief, hope, joy. So like emotions or just sort of relationships and other people. Not exactly sure what the coworker is doing there, but anyway. What's particularly interesting is like the fraction of people who say costs. And as you can imagine, when you do this by low and high income, when you think about like medical conditions for the rich, this is much more about like emotions, about their health, about like their relationships, their loved ones, and so on. When the poor think about like health or health expenditures or health issues, they think very much about health expenditures, and that is essentially what's top of mind for them. And so again, when you sort of split the sample by low and high income people, the poor have much higher proportions of money-related thoughts as reported by these kinds of questions compared to the rich. The third study, or last study that I'm going to show you is the study that I showed you very much at the beginning of the class, which was a study about, imagine you are about to purchase an iPad for $500. The salesman says you can get the same iPad, exact same iPad for $15 off. Would you walk for 30 minutes in total for doing it? Would you go for the other store? And similarly, if you do the same thing for an iPad case, and sort of the result that we found in this class and like that other studies have found is that people are way more likely to report that they would walk for the iPad case than for the iPad itself. And the explanation, of course, is that people evaluate things in relative terms, right? So if you think about the iPad case, $15 is like really high relative to like $30 the iPad case's value. Well, for the iPad itself, $15 compared to $500 is like not very much. Now that's in some sense some form of like money illusion or some form of unit confusion or the like, because at the end of the day, you should just be willing to walk for 30 minutes for either $15 or not. That's not going to change depending on whether you buy an iPad or an iPad case. Now, many studies have found this kind of patterns, including like in this class. But once you do that with the poor, they're much less likely, if at all, to engage in this kind of behavior, which seems to sort of suggest that the poor, in fact, are less prone to these kind of labeling or sort of like monetary comparisons. For them, essentially, a dollar is a dollar, and they sort of understand that like $15 is valuable, regardless of like what its surrounding comparisons might be. And so if I had to summarize now what I've just shown you very quickly is that thoughts about money tend to capture or take much more space in the poor's minds. These are the first two studies that I showed you. And second, the extra focus on money has actually some positive consequences in some sense. In some sense, you can say here, this is an irrational decision to say, yes, that you will do it for the iPad case compared to like the iPad, or it's sort of there's some misoptimization going on. So the poor are actually doing better. They're less prone to these kinds of errors compared to the rich. I think that's a good thing. People like potentially better monetary decisions here. So there's some positive consequences or impacts based on that. But now, and this is where we're going to go, is, well, are there also some negative effects potentially? The reason being that if you have a certain amount of attention available overall or cognitive resources available, if your brain is taken up by essentially these thoughts about money, then there will be less available resources for other stuff. Any questions on this so far? Okay, so then let's talk about the scarcity work specifically. So scarcity is actually defined generally here as not having enough of something. This could be money, friends, hair, time, etc. It's very general, actually. And so the idea is just like if you have something that you think you don't have enough, notice that the definition is pretty vague in the sense of like it's not just saying like having low income, but it's sort of thinking that you don't have enough income, which could be also like in relative terms and so on. And then the hypothesis is that scarcity capture people's mental cognitive capacity, their bandwidth, as they call it. This happens automatically and not intentionally. That is to say that it's not people choose to spend a lot of time on thinking about money, but rather money captures their minds, and then they have trouble thinking about other things. Think about this as like would be like suppose you have like some fights with a good friend of yours or a partner or the like, and then you have an important job interview. It's really not productive to think about the fight with your friend or family member or partner or the like during the job interview. There's nothing productive about doing that. You should be focusing on the interview and try to do your best. But it might be that like essentially these thoughts invade your minds and you sort of get really distracted unintentionally and then do worse in those kinds of things. And that's the idea here, similar here as well, which is that essentially there's might be some benefit of like figuring out monetary problems and figuring out how to pay the bills and so on and so forth. But overall, these benefits might be overwhelmed by taking over people's brain that leaves less resources for other things, other decisions or productivity that people have to do in life. And so in particular, poverty now, so this is a general introduction, poverty specifically makes monetary concerns top of mind. So the poor might be acting more rational in some ways, in some sense, in financial choices, which is kind of what the evidence that I just showed you, and there are several studies that try to make that point. But, scarcity might then deteriorate performance at other cognitive tasks. Now here's sort of a PowerPoint version of that, which is, people may think about many things in life. They might think about rent. They might think about the kids doing well, eating healthy, utilities, car payments, and so on. But what does scarcity do? It magnifies essentially people's thoughts about rent, car payments, and utility bills. These are all monetary things that people think about a lot. And then it might sort of like drown out or like force out other thoughts about other things, about eating healthy, or about taking care of their kids in other ways than paying the bills. Okay? And so now I'm going to show you evidence from two studies that sort of support this point. The first one is, or the paper is called Poverty Impedes Cognitive Function. That was the reading for today. The first one is called the Mall study. So what does this Mall study do? It's a kind of like a lab experiment, but it's sort of in some sense like a field experiment. So it's in a New Jersey mall that asks shoppers or stops shoppers with a median household income of roughly $70,000. So somewhat richer than the average American, but with quite a bit of range of income overall. So they select fairly rich people and fairly poor people. And then there's a sequence of 3 events, essentially, which is people that ask hypothetical questions involving money. Some are hard and some are easy. And then people are asked to do cognitive tests. These are nonverbal tests that sort of measure people's fluid intelligence, which is Raven's matrices, which you might be familiar with, just sort of IQ type tests. And some form of cognitive control, which essentially is about like, are you able to override automatic responses when making when doing cognitive tasks. And then number 3 then is like people then answer the hypothetical questions. So what does this look like? The hypothetical question is involving money, which is the following. Your car is having some trouble and requires X dollars to be fixed. You can pay in full, take a loan, or take a chance and forego the service at the moment. How would you go about making this decision? And so then people ask this question and they say, well, you can think about this for a while, and then afterwards I'm going to ask you about the answer of that question. And then there's a hard version and an easy version. The idea is that the experiment wants to keep everything the same for like across treatments. And the idea that is that $150 for the average American is not that much money, so it's not going to be like a huge problem for most people, at least in normal times of their lives. But $1,500 is actually a lot of money for like a low-income person in the US, but perhaps not that big of a deal for a rich person. Like for a rich person, the $1,500 or the $150 are both fine. They're going to have some money in their bank account and they're going to deal with it somehow, and it's not a huge issue. For the poor person, $150 is, not great, but not a huge problem or not a huge headache. But $1,500 surely is really bad. That's sort of the idea here in varying this. Now, what the study then finds is that, and let me walk you through these graphs. Let's look on the left side. On the right side is quite similar. You'll see here always 4 bars. The bars are for the dark bars are how people are doing after the hard task, and the lighter bars are after the easy task. Let's start with the light gray bars, comparing the poor versus the rich. And what you essentially see is the poor and the rich are doing pretty much the same after doing the easy task. So to be clear, what's poor versus rich is essentially a median split by the median income. So if you're above the median, you're called rich. If you're below the median, you're called poor for the purpose of this study. Now, for the easy task here, this is like the rich do essentially as well or as badly as the poor do. They get about 40% correct in these Raven's puzzles. And the poor do essentially the same. So there's no difference after the easy task. Now, after the hard task, for the rich, essentially it's the same. If anything, they do a little bit better. This difference is not statistically significant. In contrast, you see like a clear drop in performance among the poor. Okay, they do about like 12 percentage points worse. This is like really like a huge difference in how well people So this is for Raven's matrices. This is for what's called hearts and flowers for cognitive control, which is essentially how good are people at controlling their attentional resources. And what you see is essentially more or less the same pattern, that for the easy task, the rich and the poor do pretty much the same. The hard task compared to the easy task does nothing for the rich. There's essentially the performance is the same or like slightly different, but not statistically significantly so. And for the poor, there's a large drop in performance compared to the rich. Any questions on that? Okay, so then I'm going to show you sort of the second study that is related to this. So one thing you might sort of say, well, is we already showed you already a study, so why did we need another study? We already did one. We showed you that like poverty, or thinking about poverty affects people's cognition, so why do we need more evidence? That's right. So effort is an interesting issue that, so there's, in fact, this study has, and I took this out of the slides because I have too many, there's an incentivized version of this task, and the authors do find that even once you incentivize these tasks, do you find the same patterns? But even there, you know, it's a bit sort of like a task that is not a task that people do in their real life, and in a way, which is actually not what the Harvest study is addressing. You might wonder, kind of, does this translate into real world choices and decisions that are actually of consequence for people's behaviors? To be clear, these effects here, these differences in cognitive performances are very large. This is like the order of magnitude, something like 10 IQ points, which is really huge. So you might sort of argue that, you know, you think that IQ, etc., matters a lot. So in some sense, that's what Mulanathan and Shafir would argue. But no, I agree with you. In some sense, we would like to see, does this translate into real world choices that we see in people's everyday lives. Now, I think we talked about a few of those things. So one is external validity concerns, which is to say, like, look, we did like the study in the mall, which is a little bit of a funny thing to do. And like you hear about the scenario, which is kind of weird, and maybe it freaks you out, and maybe the poor are more freaked out than the rich for some reason. And like, but really, if you think about like paying back your debt, or like any sort of school fees, or just not having money, that's like a repeated exposure of something that you know in your real life. Like, for example, not having harvest versus harvest is a thing that you experience every year, or I'll be like twice a year even. And so you think, you know, some of these things might sort of go away with repeat exposure. And so we kind of would like to have like a real world setting where like we have actually real world natural variation, or sort of experimental variation potentially, as opposed to like this somewhat weird feature in like some mall, somebody talks you up and asks you some questions, which people might find funny and might not be representative for what people do in their lives. And then the second part is kind of how do we interpret magnitudes, right? So I showed you and said like, look, these effects are really large. After the hard task, the poor do worse than the rich. But we have like no idea how we should scale this in terms of like, what does this actually mean for actual effects of poverty? Like if you, suppose I give somebody $1,000 or $10,000, what does it do to people's performance? It essentially, what this shows is that the poor are more sort of frazzled by these financial questions, but it gives you essentially, and it seems to be important because the magnitude is large in these effects, but there's no way to actually scale these effects in some sense and thinking about like, what does this priming intervention actually correspond to in the real world in terms of like dollars or how rich or poor people are. So that's another sort of reason why you might want to do another study. Okay, so what is the other study? As Lauren was already saying, it's a study with 464 sugarcane farmers in 54 villages in Tamil Nadu. These are small-scale farmers that earn at least the majority, or 60% of income from sugarcane. So these are mostly sugarcane farmers. And sort of crucially for the study, the harvest is staggered over a 3 to 5 month period set by the sugar mills due to capacity constraints. So it's not that some people harvest earlier than others because they decide to do so, maybe because they need more cash, but it's rather because of capacity constraints. The sugar mill is essentially deciding who harvests early and who harvests late. And so now what the study explored is that the sugarcane harvest cycle takes about 18 months. So it's extremely long. And as a result, farmers tend to be relatively poor pre-harvest. This is kind of like, think about this as like, grad school or undergrad stipends. If you have gotten money for the month or for the semester or the like, the beginning of the semester is always amazing. You have lots of, or month for that matter, is always amazing. You have lots of cash and can do lots of nice things. And then towards the end of the month or semester, people tend to run out of cash, at least when I was a grad student or student in general. Similar things are true for like food stamps or other sort of cash programs. There's quite a bit of evidence that shows at the beginning of the month, people are doing a lot better than at the end, which sort of seems to suggest that people have trouble smoothing their income over time, which presumably has to do with some form of self-control or other problems. But so for the purpose of the study, farmers are relatively poor pre-harvest. And that now allows the authors to look at within-person comparisons of people, sometimes when they're poor and sometimes when they're rich, at looking at their cognitive performance by looking at people pre and post-harvest. Now, first, you want to kind of like see some evidence that farmers' financial situation is actually worse pre-harvest. And so there's quite a few, and you can focus on the first column here, quite a few pieces of evidence. People are more likely to have their belongings pawned. They're more likely to have loans outstanding. They also have more loans outstanding. They're also more likely to say yes to the question, or higher scores to the question about their ability to cope with ordinary bills in the past 15 days. And so post-harvest. And so all of these things that I was saying, essentially, before harvest, farmers are like in a financially tricky situation, and after harvest that gets better because they get essentially a bunch of cash from this harvest, because essentially it's a cash crop. You sell your sugarcane and then you get a bunch of money that you can use over the next 18 months. Now, then the authors find, again, using Raven's matrices and some measures of cognitive control, that people are doing a lot worse pre-harvest compared to post-harvest. In terms of Raven's matrices, this is accuracy. Essentially, people do better. They're like getting more Raven's matrices correct compared to the control group. They're also doing better in terms of cognitive control. Post-harvest response times go down, which is a good thing here. And post-harvest also, like, people's errors go down in these measures. And there's a lot of detail related to that, but in some sense, that doesn't matter much for you right now. People are essentially doing better post-harvest when they have more cash. Now, what confounds can you think about, and what are potential problems with this result? Like, surely this is consistent with poverty impeding cognitive function, but there could be other things going on. And what are these other things? I think there's some good evidence, or one good thing is that like it would have to be like a very specific shock that has to do with harvest, because there's essentially the harvest period was staggered over several months. So it's not like at some point the weather got worse or the weather got better because some people actually harvested earlier than others, and there's a pre-post comparison. But there could be other stuff, time trends or something going on, at least in some ways. In a way, I think confound, or in a way, it's also just like a different interpretation, perhaps in some ways, in the sense of saying like, well, it's not just worries about the level of income, but it's also worries about essentially risk or anxiety, essentially. And so that's slightly different, but that anxiety could also sort of capture people's minds in some ways. Of course, then you would want to see something like maybe that's worse for the rich compared to the poor, or things like that. But that's exactly right. So there could be essentially labor costs or any sort of other distractions related to the harvest, which this is kind of related to what Manila was saying, which is like the harvest itself might have these kinds of effects. Okay, I think we mentioned most of the things that I have on my list. So, So there's first one is calorie consumption, which is sort of the typical thing that development economists would study a lot, which is to say, poor nutrition might sort of make people do worse. It's bad for attention. We talked a little bit about like shopping on a hungry stomach, but also think about like doing tests or exams on a hungry stomach is probably not a good. Empty stomach is probably not a good idea. The authors have some evidence that like the food expenditures are pretty similar pre and post harvest from like some other sample. Overall, malnutrition doesn't seem to be like a huge issue in this area. Having said that, I think it's also reasonable to think that like pre and post harvest, you should have actually more money, and then you got to spend the money on something, and presumably some of that would go on food. But anyway, so the authors argue that nutrition is not a big issue. Then there's sort of two broad issues with, I think, was Jocelyn's and Catherine's comments, which is about the uncertainty of the harvest size and some issues related to labor effort. And so here, the authors have some evidence from a post-harvest prepayment sample. What does that mean? This is a sample that these are people who have already harvested already, so they've already exerted the labor effort. They also know already their approximate payment. And so I was getting confused by this. But so these are people who have already done the harvest. They have already they have done all the work already. They know already what the harvest size will be like. But those people essentially are still not doing better compared to the people who have received their cash. So that essentially is to say, like, even once you have done all the effort and so on, that doesn't seem to help in the sense of you're not exhausted from the work already. You already have all your harvest there. You already know how big your harvest is, but you haven't really received the money yet. And you know already what the harvest size is. It can't really be about anxiety of the harvest size. Yet, if you compare those people to the people who have received the money, you still see differences between those people and the people who have done already the harvest. And so that sort of that argues that essentially it's not about anxiety per se about the harvest size, but rather about like just having money in your pocket versus not. Let me see what the correct graph. I see. So this is a little bit misleadingly labeled. What this is supposed to say is like, this is post-harvest and pre-harvest, but what they mean by post-harvest and pre-harvest, post-harvest is meant by like you have received the cash versus not, but both of these are actually both post-harvest in the sense that they have done already the work. Anyway, sorry, that's a bit confusing. But essentially, what they're trying to say is essentially what really matters is like not the work around the harvest per se or the uncertainty around the harvest. It's really about like receiving the cash versus not. And then there's like another problem which you haven't really brought up, which is the issue of learning effects, right? when people do the task like several times, presumably, and do a test twice, you're going to do better. And but to address this issue, they also have like what they call like a holdout sample that takes the cognitive test for the first time post-harvest. So what I showed you before was pre-post for both people that have done both of these tests. There's some sample that's only done the task like once post-harvest, and they don't perform worse than people who do the task for the second time, which seems to say like it's not really about learning. Having said that, that is essentially only like a small subsample. The comparison really seems mostly underpowered, and there's some concerns surely about still effects. Any questions on these? Okay. And, so then, so this is a study from like a few years ago. So then, what kind of follow-up is there that sort of considers further evidence? So there's one very nice study by Carvalho et al. From 2015 that looks at the same issue in the US. And they look at cognition and decision-making of US households around paydays. And essentially, they find no cognitive effects whatsoever. They also find no effects on decision-making as one would have expected. Raises the question about what's going on here. And what's going on. So it could be that this is an external validity issue in some sense, this really what is needed here is really like extreme poverty and like really large differences in like people's income or like the amount of money that they have available. And sort of when you look at US households, at least the households that were considered in the Carvalho study around paydays, where there's differences in how much money they have, cash on hand they have, the difference is actually not that huge. And so that might just be not sufficiently much variation around those paydays to be able to generate those types of effects. It could also be that these effects don't really replicate in a sense of like there's a replicability issue, which could be a concern as well. There's a nice study, and this gets to the issue that I think Jose mentioned, which is a study by Lishand and is looking at drought insurance. And what they essentially argue is that when you propose with insurance, so usually insurance, so people would argue insurance is useful if a bad state happens in the world, you can essentially get a payment, right? If I get some health shock, or if my harvest is bad or the like, I get some money from the insurance company, and that is good because in the bad state, if the marginal utility is really high of receiving money, and sort of I'm willing to pay for insurance right now, in the future, I'm willing to pay for insurance now because in the future, in a bad state of the world, I value that money more than in a good state of the world. So in a good state of the world, it's willing to pay for insurance. Now, what Lishand and Mani are instead arguing is, well, there's an additional value of insurance, which essentially it's helping reduce their anxiety and worries about money ex ante in all states of the world. That is to say, if I'm really worried about like bad harvest shocks or other stuff, health shocks happening in the future, that might really frazzle me and really sort of worry me all the time, which in turn might affect people's cognitive performance. Well, that's in all states of the world. Even when you're doing well right now, and even if nothing bad ever happens, you're going to do worse today because you're worried about these things, and sort of providing insurance, therefore, might help people do better even in good states of the world or in all states of the world, in addition to sort of having the insurance value of helping people in bad state of the world. They have some evidence of it, that there's some mixed evidence overall, but I think the idea of like insurance being helpful for the poor, for anybody, not just because it helps in bad states, but it helps people worry about bad states, is a very nice one that hopefully will be explored further. Now then, another question I think Jose was bringing up is to say, well, there are these cognitive tasks. Well, I showed you so far that there are these tasks in like Raven's matrices and cognitive control, and sort of arguably IQ tests are important and helpful, and sort of, we think that's helpful and it maps to something useful for the world, but it's a little bit hard to tell, like, does this actually matter for income? Is it really important or not important, and how much does it? So in a paper with Flipped Core, and we looked at this in a field setting with workers in Orissa and rural areas in India. And what we did there is we hired people for about 2 weeks to do a simple labor task where they were doing leaf plates, essentially like putting together leaves into plates, which are sort of used in many settings by stitching them together using like little wooden sticks. And so people are hired for 2 weeks, and then for the sample, we varied when some people were paid earlier and some people were paid later. So everybody was paid exactly the same, conditional on showing up and conditional on how much they produced. So their piece rates, how much they were paid, were the same, and their attendance paid for showing up. The only difference was that some people were paid earlier and some people were paid later. So that allows us then to look at how do people, the same people, how do they perform when they're ready versus not, compared to another group that is essentially only paid later. And this is a period, in the lean period, when people are extremely financially constrained. So people are really short in cash. So we can look at essentially really at the impact of transfers or cash constraints in this setting. What we find is a relatively clear evidence that paying people early makes people a lot more productive. And moreover, these effects are the largest for the poorest workers. So essentially, when you sort of divide the sample in two among the people who are richer and poorer to start with, people who are particularly poor have the largest impacts in the sample. And these are sort of pretty large effects. It's about 5 to 10% of their productivity, which is, it doesn't sound that large in absolute terms, but in relative terms, or in terms of like, when you double people's wages, people's earnings go up only as much or not much more. So really increasing people's productivity is very, very hard in these settings. And relatively minor interventions, such as the one that we did, had pretty large effects in the real world setting for people for whom this is really their real jobs in their real life for about 2 weeks. So suppose you hired somebody for a year. Should you pay them like daily, weekly, monthly, or what? And so what I'm arguing, or what our evidence shows, that when you hire people for 2 weeks, paying people twice, as in like paying people once after a week and then the rest at the end, makes workers more productive than paying workers only at the very end. And assuming, depending on like the interest rate, but that seems to be like a thing the company should do. Now, but of course, if you hire people for like a year, then paying people weekly versus monthly or bi-weekly, the comparison becomes quite different, because essentially the control group that's paid after 2 weeks, now after 2 weeks, of course, they have a lot more money because they haven't spent it, compared to the treatment group who's paid earlier. And I think there essentially we can't really speak to that. In some sense, our design is just not really set up to do this. You would have to do at least, you would have to do at least another week or two to measure how's the control group now doing compared to the treatment group, or like do it repeatedly. There might also be some effects on like over time, repeatedly, some of these effects might be going away because workers learn and so on and so forth. I think of this evidence much more as a proof of concept that providing cash or alleviating cash constraints among workers, either through some low interest rate loans or some early payments or some form of like UBI or cash transfers, unconditional or conditional cash transfers, essentially improving workers' financial situation in some ways can be productive for firms. Now, how the firm then actually does that, we don't necessarily know, and this is sort of too small of a short of an experiment to show that. But it's sort of proof of concept that in a real world setting with very high stakes for workers, this is their like real earnings. There seem to be these effects. So for firms, it might be well to in fact try to improve their financial situation. Or for governments, it might be valuable to think about cash transfers as a way to. So usually when you think about cash transfers, and let me actually talk about this for a second, and then we can talk about other confounds of the study. So usually when you think about the public debate about cash transfers and about sort of like welfare programs for the poor, often sort of the right-wing response is like, well, aren't the poor going to be lazy and they're not going to work? And they're like, what about effort and so on and so forth, and they get used to the money and then don't work hard enough eventually. Well, the evidence that we have here in our paper seems to say, in fact, the opposite. That is to say, workers, when you alleviate their financial constraints. When you give them cash, they become more productive and they work harder than otherwise. Granted, we don't have any labor supply response. So what I'm showing you here is essentially productivity, which is, how hard a worker is working or how much a worker is producing per hour worked. But I think similar things could be true for cash transfers. And there's some quite interesting evidence on cash transfer programs. So both cash transfer and in particular what's called ultra poor programs, which are sort of these multi-faceted asset programs, lead to large and sustained increases in asset savings, consumptions, etc. That is to say, once you provide people with financial resources when they're very poor, not only do they better in the short run, but in the case of the ultra poor programs, in the long run, 3 to 5 years later, people are doing better in terms of like having more assets, saving more, consuming more, and so on. And that seems to say that there might be some things, an issue going on, and some form of like a poverty trap going on, and sort of some of the underlying potential channels might be things like scarcity, stress, mental health, and so on. I'm going to talk a little bit about mental health and stress in a second. But essentially, if there are these types of effects going on for the government or any other sort of public policy, these kinds of programs, conditional and unconditional cash transfers, have, in addition to having the advantage of like improving people's well-being and having like a high marginal utility of money when they're very poor, it might also in addition make people more productive as opposed to like working less or the like. So I think those two things are sort of the takeaways. If one wanted to understand optimal pay structures, one would have to do longer run types of experiments, as Natalie pointed out. So there's essentially, the way we set this up is we essentially people, sorry, this is my Slack, pay people to, people through the employer. Essentially said, okay, the employer is paying you now earlier versus later. And naturally then the worker might just happier, doing better financially, but also like the employer better and saying like, look, you just paid me early. I now trust you more that you're going to be paying me in the future. Maybe that's some form of giving a reciprocity. I'm sort of happy about things, work harder to make the employer happy. Several things to get at this, and the most important part perhaps is we also have like we announce essentially the structure a few days before the actual payment is made. That is to say, on day 5 we announce and say on day 8 you're going to be paid, versus we don't announce, so we say we're going to be paid only later at the end of the study. And so if you think this is about reciprocity or like people being feelings towards the employer, you would think that then workers should then already be working harder once they're hear about when they get these kind of announcement effects. And it seems to be the case that there's essentially no announcement effect whatsoever. Workers only become productive pretty much precisely once they receive their cash on hand, which is very much consistent with what I showed you earlier, the results from Mani et al. In their study. It seems to really be the case that knowing that somebody will be paid is really not helping workers, both from or making workers more productive, both in the form of their relationship or due to their relationship with the employer, but also due to other effects, including sort of like perhaps their worries or concerns that they might have about it. So it seems to be that similarly to the Mani et al. Paper, so like when workers have done their harvest and you have the harvest in front of you and it's worth so many rupees, that doesn't seem to increase their cognitive scores. That's what I was showing you earlier. Really what it seems to be is like you have to be actually paid. So once workers actually have the cash in hand, only then their cognitive function goes up. There seems to be something about this with this money in hand. This example I have for you is like, suppose you have to pay your bills, suppose you don't have enough money, and then on the first of the month you're going to be paid your stipend or whatever as a student. There's something distinctly different from having actually been paid the money on your bank account and having it in your possession that is yours, or being sent a check or whatever, as opposed to knowing it's going to come in 2 days and you have your outstanding credit card bills, even if you know that you can pay them. That's in some sense from introspection the best example I have for you. But it seems to be, and then you're right, in some sense, there could have been some effects of just telling workers you're going to be paid early versus later. But it doesn't seem to be the case. It really seems to be the case of like receiving the money, having cash in hand, and then being able to pay the money lender or pay essentially some person that you owe money, some money back, seems to be what's quite important for generating those kinds of effects. Okay, so let's move on. I already talked about this. Essentially, yeah, so there seem to be these large effects of ultra-poor programs, which seem to say that there might be some underlying behavioral or other poverty trap going on. And sort of, we don't have the answer to that, but one hypothesis is that some of the underlying psychological issues might be responsible for that. Now, what are other poverty-induced deprivations? So poverty entails a bunch of different deprivations beyond money, including malnutrition, higher levels of stress, sleep deprivation. People's sleeping conditions tend to be terrible. Noise pollution, the poor are more disproportionately exposed to noise. There's environmental pollution, in particular sort of air, that the poor are much more exposed to. Heat, the poor often don't have access to, or heat and or temperature more generally. The poor are more exposed to high temperature and don't have access to ACs often. There's also some form of like stigma and exclusion, which might have certain cognitive and other effects. There's some evidence of disproportionate substance abuse. I showed you some evidence of increased excessive drinking. And there's also quite a bit of evidence of increased mental illness especially among the poor. So within any given location, the poor are disproportionately affected by mental illness, including things like depression and anxiety. But there's a bunch of research in other settings that shows that these factors, each of these factors affect either health and or cognitive function. And so you might wonder, how are these factors then affecting people's decision-making and choices? And just to give you some example of this is some work that we have done in Chennai, or to like give you some sense of what this looks like. The poor essentially tend to have very, very challenging sleeping conditions. There's dust, noise, mosquitoes, people sleep in the same room, people sleep outside in the middle of the street, and it's hot, people sleep on the floor. So essentially any challenging sleeping condition that you can think of, you can find it among the urban poor. And so one question you might ask is, well then, does this lack of good sleep affect people's capacity to work and their decision making? And so in our study, what we do is we objectively measure sleep quantity and quality in Chennai, and we document severe sleep deprivation and alarmingly low quality of sleep in this setting. What do I mean by this? People sleep on average about 6.5 hours per night, and the quality of their sleep is low, which is one measurement of that is like their fraction of time that they sleep among the time that they spend in bed is about 70%. That's what's referred to as like sleep efficiency. Sleep efficiency is way higher in rich countries. It's about 85 to 90%. So if the rich spend like an hour in bed, they spend about like 55 or something minutes asleep. If the poor do that, it's about 40 something minutes. So essentially there's lots of awakenings, and as a consequence, in our sample, people sleep about like 5.5 hours per night. Now then, what we do is we have two interventions to increase sleep. We provide people information, sleep devices, and sort of, which is like mattress, earplugs, eye shades, and so on. And we increase sleep by quite a bit for about 3 weeks in this experiment. We also have an intervention that's a nap intervention that offers people naps at the office, which increases both, or provides like high quantity and high quality of sleep in that setting. Now, what we find then is somewhat surprisingly that actually increasing people's night sleep does very little. So like people sleep about 20 to 30 minutes more every night for 3 weeks. And we measure the labor supply, we hire them for about that time. People are not doing better in any way in terms of like People are not working more, people are not more productive, people are not doing better in cognitive tasks, they're not happier, and so on and so forth. They also don't make different decisions. And if anything, they decrease their labor supply, they actually work fewer hours. Why is that? Well, because people are spending so much more time in bed, they have now less time available during the day, and some of that time goes into like working fewer hours. Now, in contrast, the nap treatment has pretty large effects on their productivity, attention, well-being, patience, and so on. So it's not like sleep cannot affect people's outcomes in these settings, but rather night sleep as it is does not really do very much, at least the type of night sleep that people are getting. And so what we then sort of provide some evidence of that, like, what's really important here, or the reason why people's sleep does not do very much in increasing their productivity or improving their outcomes, is because the quality of sleep is so low. So when we sort of look at the sample and look at like people who sleep better and worse at baseline at the beginning of the study, people who sleep better at the beginning of the study, they actually tend to have reasonably large effects on their productivity. In contrast, people who have bad sleep to start with, like for them, essentially increasing their sleep does nothing and potentially makes things worse. So what do we learn? I do not want you to take away that like sleeping does not do anything. MIT students are chronically undersleeping, and you could be probably sleeping more, both of you, all of you, or most of you. Essentially, what we learn from this is that when people's sleep conditions are really terrible, well then increasing one's sleep actually doesn't do very much. The return on sleeping is just very, very low. And so what we learn in some ways that the poor, at least in this setting, the poor are actually doing as well as they could, in the sense of they do the best they can. And since sleep is so bad or so terrible, people sleep really badly, increasing their sleep does not do very much. That's not to say like if you actually fix their sleeping conditions, if you put everybody into like a nice hotel or a nice bedroom and or give them like a nice house and help them sleep better, that wouldn't have potentially large effects. But the study that we conducted was not doing that. The study that we conducted was essentially saying, like, take your sleep conditions as given and look at what happens when you increase people's sleep duration for sort of given sleep quality, and that doesn't do very much. In contrast, as I showed you, or I told you, naps seem to be quite effective in having a large number of or range of effects, which seems to say that like sleep can potentially matter quite a bit. But what really is important is try to figure out how could we perhaps increase people's sleep quality, which might have that important effects. So that was a lot of information, more than I perhaps intended. Any questions on that? Okay. So then the last piece, which I'm going to just sort of say a little bit about, is a paper that we just finished on the relationship between poverty and common mental disorders, as they're referred to, which is anxiety and depression. And what we there sort of argue, and it's a pretty short paper. If you're interested, I'll in fact put it on my website tonight. We're looking at essentially the relationship between poverty and these two conditions. And what we do is first we show the causal effect in both directions. And so there's quite a bit of evidence that essentially being poor is bad for people's mental health. And these are like causal studies. So for example, providing people cash transfers improves consistently their mental health. So there's a causal effect of from not having money on people's mental health, on anxiety and depression. At the same time, there's a causal effect of anxiety and depression on people's ability to earn income and thus their poverty. So for example, if you provide people with CBT or some other forms of psychotherapy, that improves their, reduces their depression, and then in turn it increases their labor supply, which in turn presumably increases their ability to earn income. So there's causal effects in both directions, from poverty to common mental disorders, and from common mental disorders to poverty. And then what the paper does in a lot more detail is then think about what are different mechanisms for this causal relationship, and what evidence do they actually have of that. And so on the side from poverty or from economic conditions to mental health, there's a number of different issues that could be quite important, ranging from like stresses or just being exposed to lots of shocks and therefore worries and uncertainty, to environmental conditions. In particular, there's quite a bit of emerging evidence of pollution being bad for people's mental health. So essentially pollution causing depression, for example. There's some potential for physical health. Just being in bad health might might be bad for your mental health, in part because it causes physical pain and other sort of illnesses. There's some evidence of early life conditions. So growing up in poverty tends to be bad for people's mental health, and there's some nice evidence of shocks to to mothers' or fathers' income might cause mental illness much later in life for the children. There's quite a bit of evidence of trauma, violence, and crime, which the poor are disproportionately exposed to, affecting people's mental health. And finally, social status, shame, and isolation. If you sort of like stigmatized and like isolated from society, that might be bad for your mental health. Particular sort of relative comparisons could be quite important. And then at the same time, there are effects in the other directions coming from depression and anxiety. So one profound way in which depression and anxiety affect people's behavior is cognitive function, the way people think. So in contrast to other things such as health, depression and anxiety affect the way people think, including and then that might sort of affect people's beliefs, their confidence, overconfidence, underconfidence, belief updating, all the stuff that we talked about in the class, as well as their preferences, their time preferences, risk preferences, social preferences, and so on. It might affect their labor productivity and their labor supply, how much people work and how productive they are. Of course, people might be very stigmatized and treated badly because of mental illness, which in addition sort of then makes people less likely to seek help potentially, because, you know, if you're then stigmatized, you might not want to declare to your employer, to anybody else, that you're depressed. People tend to have worse health conditions if they're depressed, or if they suffer from mental illness, or other health conditions tend to get worse, and health expenditures. There's also some evidence of depression affecting women's empowerment. I think there's two potential channels here. One is that women are in fact disproportionately by depression, anxiety, and so on. So like the measured prevalence is about twice as high. And so, you know, to the extent that now if you improve people's mental health, women will disproportionately benefit from that. And then there's evidence that once you do that, women have higher bargaining power in the household, more say about resources spent, and so on and so forth. And then finally, potentially quite important, is effects on young people. This ranges from like primary and secondary schooling to like college students and so on, which is to say that a lot of mental health conditions appear during adolescence. And so those are often when very critical decisions are made when it comes to education, like do you drop out of school, do you go to college, and so on and so forth. It turns out there's actually quite not a lot of causal evidence on this, but it seems very plausible that this could be quite important. And sort of taking these things together, it seems to me that poverty through like various different channels, including scarcity, which I showed you at the beginning, but also including all these other conditions, might affect profoundly the way and how they make decisions and how productive they are at work, which then could reinforce poverty and make it harder for people to become richer. This is a lot of information, so any questions, I'm happy to discuss or answer any questions that you would have. I'm not expecting you to remember all of those things. I was just more elaborating for anybody who might be interested. You can also read all of these things in the paper that I'll add to the course website as well. All right. So on Wednesday, we're going to talk about happiness and mental health. Please read the paper by Kahneman and Deaton. Notice I just changed this in the syllabus, so if you have an old version of the syllabus, please make sure you read the new paper. The paper is very short, so it shouldn't be tricky to read. Essentially, it's looking at what kinds of things predict whether people are happy or not. And then on Monday, we're going to talk about policy with behavioral agents. Just as a reminder, we'll have a guest at the end of class next time. I hope the guest will come at 2:20. I'm hoping for a llama to visit us, but it could also be a goat. We'll see how that goes. Any questions or comments? When it comes to depression and anxiety specifically, I'm going to talk about more generally. So one of the things I'm working on, for example, is looking at the impact of cognitive behavioral therapy or other psychotherapies to improve people's mental health, and then look at the effects on people's beliefs. How confident are they in themselves? How they update their beliefs. And remember, we had this stuff on like from Eileen Rao and others about like asymmetric belief updating. And is that affected, for example, by people's mental health? Moreover, we look at preferences, which is precisely time preferences, social preferences, risk preferences. And once you improve people's depression, does that affect people's time, social, and risk preferences? More broadly, there's quite a few people trying to do studies, and I went over this fairly quickly, to look at these kinds of types of effects. Which, for example, there's some work on malnutrition that shows like once you provide people with more calories, there's some indications of like less discounting, which is kind of what you're alluding to. There's some work on like the relationship between stress and discounting. There's actually not that much evidence, or less evidence than you would expect. For sleep deprivation, for example, we find when people nap, they're less present biased compared to when they haven't napped. I find, for example, for alcohol consumption, I do find that people save more, and it seems to be not driven by having more money. So again, that seems to be consistent with people's time preferences in some way affected by these conditions. Overall, there's quite a bit of evidence so far on productivity. So papers essentially show that when you're disproportionately exposed to heat, people are less productive, people learn less. When you're exposed to noise, people are less productive. When people have less nutrition, they're less productive, and so on and so forth. There's less evidence so far on decision-making and sort of preferences overall. That's what people are currently working on. But that's exactly the question. Can we sort of explain potentially some of the stuff that I was mentioning at the very beginning of the lecture? Can we explain potentially certain behavioral biases or certain deviations from the neoclassical model by alleviating some of or addressing some of the psychological. We don't have a lot of evidence, and we hope to have some more, but that's exactly what people are working on.